This is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Paul Barber. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories this hour.
You don't have the cards right now. Cards. Right now, you're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
A heated showdown. US President Donald Trump accuses Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky of overplaying his hand as their meeting in the Oval Office devolves into a shouting match. President Zelensky touches down in London ahead of a European summit on peace, saying he wants the US to stand more firmly with Ukraine. There's no sign of an agreement on what's next for the Gaza ceasefire as phase 1 of the deal officially expires. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived here in London and is meeting the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Downing Street. On Sunday, European leaders will gather in the British capital for a summit on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky's visit follows a fiery meeting with US President Donald Trump in the White House on Friday. The two leaders clashed over a ceasefire deal with Russia and did not sign an anticipated rare earth minerals agreement. Zelensky says he wants the US to stand more firmly on his country's side and needs security guarantees from Washington before he signs. He described a tough dialogue in his meeting with Trump and US Vice President J.D. Vance.
Do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
During the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
Our correspondent Stuart Smith has the reaction from Kiev.
You received a lot of support, in terms of official support, from here in Ukraine. The foreign minister saying that Zelensky has the bravery and strength to stand up for what is right, that the president stands for the goal of a just and lasting peace. The speaker of the Ukrainian parliament said no one should forget who is the victim in this. And largely that has been the kind of attitude we've heard on the streets of Kiev, with the president being boosted by the public, who suggest that they will continue to support him and that he shouldn't be bullied by the United States. An opposition lawmaker, though, said that what Zelensky had done at the White House could cause major problems for Ukraine. He said, why arrange a scandal with the US president in front of the cameras? This quarrel can have very bad consequences, from disabling Starlink to blocking all the US intelligence information that the United States provides to Ukraine. Another official, a former representative to the European Union from Ukraine, said raising your voice in the Oval Office at the Vice President and President and then interrupting both of them does not serve the interests of Ukraine. Well, ahead of the meeting in Washington, President Zelensky had emphasized numerous times just how important the meeting was going to be, because security guarantees are desperately needed in Ukraine and military support continues to be required by the armed forces here. The estimates are, in unofficial circles, that Ukraine could last about 6 months without further help from the United States. And so what President Zelensky will be trying to do now is to, if he cannot directly encourage the United States to continue its support, the question for now is President Trump open to that. He didn't say the minerals deal was off, but it's certainly off for now, and the White House has suggested it's looking at ending military support to Ukraine, at least in the near term. It's also, though, guaranteed it's no longer the USAID, part of the US government, going to be providing support to the energy grid, which has been damaged multiple times and continues to be hit by Russian drone strikes. So that is definitely one loss that has happened as a consequence of this meeting.
Stuart Smith there in Kiev. So how is the Oval Office dust-up going down in DC the morning after? Washington correspondent Simon Marks reports.
I think Washington is still reeling from an absolutely unprecedented event in the Oval Office of the White House. And, Paul, as you would expect, in a country as polarized as this one, opinions divide into two separate camps. I mean, we witnessed in the immediate aftermath of that brawl between the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, and the Ukrainian leader, Senator Lindsey Graham, an influential Republican from South Carolina. He sits on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Relations Committee. He's often been seen as a Trump whisperer, especially on issues pertaining to international affairs. He walked out into the White House driveway and told reporters that he had never been prouder of a president or vice president of the United States, believed that Volodymyr Zelensky should consider resigning as a result of what he described as disrespectful behavior that he had exhibited towards the President of the United States. And, you know, the fact that J.D. Vance was particularly claiming that President Zelensky had not thanked the United States enough for its military assistance certainly has resonated with core grassroots supporters of President Trump's Make America Great Again movement, who do look at that videotape and buy the argument that it was President Zelensky who was disrespectful and who was sort of instigating the difficulties that publicly evinced themselves, even though the President of the United States made the decision to turn what normally would have been a routine photo opportunity where the two leaders welcome one another and then the cameras leave the room into a made-for-television 45-minute encounter. President Trump's critics are arguing that this really heralds the beginning of the end of America's 80-year transatlantic alliance with its European allies. The think tank run by former President George W. Bush has published an article encouraging European leaders, and they of course will be meeting in London tomorrow, hosted by Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK, to consider seizing the $350 billion in Russian assets that have been frozen by the Europeans as a result of Russian sanctions that have been imposed, European sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since the conflict began. And the Bush Centre is certainly arguing that those finances should now be transferred to Ukraine to provide it with continuing assistance during the conflict and used by Europe as it begins the process of reacting to the sudden realization over the course of the last couple of weeks that perhaps the United States government is no longer committed to Europe's defence.
Simon Marks in Washington. President Zelensky arrived here in London a short while ago ahead of a wider summit of European leaders in the British capital to discuss a peace plan for Ukraine. Our correspondent Michael Marilia is outside the Prime Minister's office in Downing Street and joins us now. So, Michael, when is President Zelensky due to arrive there at Downing Street to meet Keir Starmer? And what's on the cards for tomorrow for this big European summit?
Well, I can tell you that activity has been building outside Downing Street for the last couple of hours. We have got some indication that he should be here possibly within the next hour or two. Of course, this is ahead of that summit involving UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and, of course, European leaders as they try to plot a course in terms of Europe's response to this conflict in Ukraine. We've had a few statements as well from Downing Street over the last 24 hours. Downing Street saying that Prime Minister Keir Starmer retains his unwavering support for Ukraine and is playing his part to find a path forward to lasting peace based on sovereignty and security for Ukraine. And now, of course, Keir Starmer hosting this summit on Sunday, perhaps working as some sort of mediator between Europe and President Trump. We know that Starmer was in the White House on Thursday meeting with the president, offering an invitation to President Trump to come to the UK on a state visit. So certainly some fairly good relations between the UK and the United States right now. We have had some other statements from European leaders like Italy's Giorgia Meloni, for example, suggesting perhaps that the EU and the US needs to have a summit of its own in order to try and iron out some of their differences. We're also getting reports from Reuters suggesting that perhaps Turkey could play a role in peace talks between Russia and the Ukraine at some stage. Reports suggesting that perhaps a Turkish diplomat or the Turkish foreign minister could address those leaders at the summit on Sunday, outlining what role Turkey could play in perhaps facilitating some sort of talks. So plenty of moving parts at the moment, but certainly the stage set outside Downing Street ahead of this visit by President Zelensky.
And has there been any more indication, Michael, about whether we'll see British or European soldiers actually on the ground in Ukraine at some stage if a peace deal is agreed to?
Well, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is saying that potentially British troops could be on the ground as peacekeepers, so not to take part in any sort of offensive involving a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but essentially to help keep the peace once that peace deal is in place. We've also had a few comments from the British Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, indicating that the UK will never choose between the US and Ukraine, that both countries remain Britain's allies, also indicating potentially that billions of pounds could be released to Ukraine within a matter of days. So for the moment, it seems the support is essentially financial. No indication yet as to whether that will be military support in the shape of soldiers or peacekeepers on the ground.
Michael, thanks so much for bringing us right up to date from Downing Street. That's our correspondent, Michael Marilia. Now, many European leaders have rallied around President Zelensky, affirming their support for Kiev. Our correspondent, Will Denslow, is in Brussels.
Plenty of support coming from a number of European leaders. Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, telling the Ukrainian people that they are not alone. We've heard from French President Emmanuel Macron, says that Europe was right to stand by Ukraine, support Ukraine 3 years ago, and it was right to sanction Russia 3 years ago, and it will continue to provide that support for Kiev. It hasn't been universal support, though. We have heard from Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has long railed against European policies towards Kiev. He says that strong men make peace, weak men make war, essentially calling on the EU to stand with Donald Trump and really to give peace a chance. Viktor Orban has been against the further talk of military support for Ukraine at this period, saying that that could hamper peace negotiations and peace efforts. We also had a very strong reaction from Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, who said that following this meeting, she posted on social media that it is clear the free world needs a new leader. It's up to us, Europeans, to take on the challenge. This, of course, comes ahead of that big summit in London on Sunday and ahead of next Thursday's emergency summit of European Union leaders taking place here in Brussels. Of course, a huge question is whether Europe would have the capability to continue supporting Ukraine without the United States. A huge question for EU leaders is how they can continue to cajole Washington to keep them on side when it comes to support for Ukraine, and what more Europe can do. We've heard from Lithuanian officials who have given us a little bit of a sense of what might be some issues of discussion at both of these meetings in the coming days. They say that the unfreezing of or using frozen Russian assets, unblocking another $20 billion or so in emergency funds for immediately supplying Ukraine with weaponry, and also that major topic of whether to send European peacemakers should a peace plan be implemented.
Will Denslow in Brussels. In other news, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, has declared an immediate ceasefire with Turkey. This after a call from its jailed leader Abdullah Öcalan for the group to disarm. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's government and the pro-Kurdish DEM party have voiced support for a ceasefire. However, Ankara has not responded for calls to release Öcalan. He's been in prison for more than 25 years, much of it in solitary confinement. The ceasefire could end the 40-year Kurdish-Turkish conflict that has claimed more than 40,000 lives. China's manufacturing index rose to 50.2 in February. That's up 1.1 points from January. This marks a 3-month high in manufacturing, likely driven by expansions in high-tech and equipment production. The National Bureau of Statistics said the rebound was helped by factories resuming work after the Spring Festival. And Chinese e-commerce giant JD.com has officially begun providing full social insurance for its full-time food delivery riders. The company announced it will cover social insurance and Housing Provident Fund contributions for its 1.3 million riders, ensuring their take-home pay remains unchanged. This makes JD.com the first Chinese food delivery platform to offer such benefits, with rival Meituan also announcing plans to follow suit. This is CGTN still ahead. There's no sign of an agreement on what comes next for the Gaza ceasefire as phase 1 of the deal officially expires.
This week on Razor, how finding water has inspired a new era of moon exploration.
First of all, it's going to provide us resources as it is, and then humans are going to use the moon bases as testbed for actually practicing technologies, practicing living there, working there, so that then they can go beyond it and make more scientific discoveries.
These are the headlines. A heated showdown. US President Donald Trump accuses Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy of overplaying his hand as their meeting in the Oval Office devolves into a shouting match. And President Zelenskyy touches down in London ahead of a European summit on peace, saying he wants the US to stand more firmly with Ukraine. The first phase of the Gaza ceasefire is coming to an end, but there's no sign of an agreement on the second phase. Negotiators have been holding talks in Egypt, but Hamas says it has rejected an Israeli plan to extend the first phase. The second round of the ceasefire is supposed to secure the release of more hostages and work towards a permanent end to the conflict. Our correspondent Jonathan Regev reports from Tel Aviv.
It's a very big question, which is not answered at the moment. There was some kind of a security consultation last night between Benjamin Netanyahu, the heads of the security establishment, and the Minister of Defense and others. It's something that usually does not happen on a Friday evening, on the Jewish Sabbath, but still it did happen last night. No major headlines coming out of there. Not sure if Israel would still insist on negotiating or perhaps a return to the war. That is something that may happen. It seems as if there are demands on both sides that cannot be met. As far as Hamas is concerned, the demand is for the war to be officially over and for the Israeli forces to withdraw entirely from the Gaza Strip, not to the perimeter, as it is called here in Israel, a few hundred yards inside Gaza territory, but to the Israeli border altogether. As far as Israel is concerned, there's no end to the war and no complete withdrawal. As long as both sides are not able to come closer, then it seems that an agreement is not really on the horizon.
And Jonathan, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to meet his security team. What are we expecting from that meeting?
The very big question is, as you mentioned, what will Israel do next? Will it give another chance to negotiations or head back to the continuation of the war? What Israel would want more than anything is an extension of the first phase, meaning hostages still coming back without Israel declaring the official end of the war. The problem with this demand is, of course, that there's another side which does not agree to that, and now Israel has to decide what to do. There's a very big public outcry for Israel to continue with the agreement. There's always a very big emotion here in Israel every Saturday for the past month and a half, when every Saturday you would see 3 living hostages coming back. This is the first Saturday, I think, in more than a month in which hostages are not returning, and now Israel has to decide what happens next. It is not very clear. We know that there are very strong factors within the coalition who are saying that Israel Israel should stop this agreement at the moment because the prices that Hamas is demanding are simply too much to pay. On the other hand, there's the American administration, which wants to see the agreement go on, at least in some way, one way or another, in order to facilitate perhaps a future normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And in between stands the Israeli government that has to decide what to do. There's no clear message coming out of Israel as to what comes next. It does seem clear that an extension of the first phase, as Israel would want, is something that is possibly not on the table at the moment. A very big question as to what comes next. No real answers.
That was our correspondent Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv. Well, for more analysis, I spoke with Samuel Romani, who's a tutor of politics and international relations at the University of Oxford.
Well, I mean, I think that there could definitely be an escalation of hostilities. And one area that could be a sore point for Hamas also in terms of the firing of rockets is the fact that Israel will not be ready to leave the Philadelphia corridor on the Egyptian-Gaza border. And the Israelis are claiming that Hamas is engaging in smuggling with pickup trucks and bringing guns in from that border. So that's kind of something that's a problem. And also there's the risk of a broader violation of the ceasefire if Hamas does not return more hostages more quickly or take more concrete steps to identify the bodies of the dead ones, including there were about 100 originally that were supposed to have been taken. The number are cut to 35, so those other 65 are still up for grabs, and we need to find out what happened to them.
Right, and you say it's going to be an uphill struggle to get this second phase over the line if there is a second phase to the ceasefire. What is likely to secure the release of all of the remaining hostages and abductees, and what steps really have to be taken to ensure that?
Well, I think that, first of all, there needs to be a cessation of hostilities completely from the Israeli side, and Netanyahu needs to withstand pressure more vigorously than he has from Smotrich and from Ben-Gvir and some of the other far-right members of his coalition who are opposed to this agreement to begin with, and see the release of exponentially more Palestinian prisoners for these hostages as some kind of almost a traitorous act. So he has to rein in those aggressive impulses. And also, there needs to be probably some progress towards the alleviation of humanitarian aid and some serious discussions about what will come next after this war is over, in terms of restoring Palestinian self-determination to the Gaza Strip, dealing with whether Hamas will have a role in government. I mean, that's a no-go for Israel, but they still remain an important political actor. So there needs to be some serious discussions about what lies ahead, and also, I think, on the Israeli side in particular, reining in some of those aggressive impulses.
And so how much of a role are the regional partners playing at the moment in driving forward this agreement? And what about the Americans?
Well, you're really seeing kind of the regional actors step over each other almost to kind of become the lead mediator in all of this. The Egyptians are obviously hosting the most significant talks on it, which is a bit of a change in their role, because typically the major talks on Israel and Hamas were being held in Doha in Qatar, and Egypt was kind of the auxiliary and the supporting partner. Now Egypt looks like it's the primary partner, and that's probably because the Philadelphia corridor is so important to these negotiations. And the Qataris, though, are also continuing to do back-channel talks, more informal diplomacy, and Saudi Arabia is also trying to coalesce various Arab countries against the notion of longer-term Israeli occupation of Gaza. But there are fundamental divisions within the Arab world. I think the Egyptians and the Qataris feel like they've engaged with Hamas over the past 18 months. They could probably manage Hamas having a political role. The Saudi Arabia, and in particular the United Arab Emirates, are opposed to Hamas having a role, and they have their own preferences as to who might take over. So the Arab countries are all engaging, but they're all divided, and the U.S. is actually less focused this time around than it was in the first ceasefire. It seems as if Trump's focus is much more on Ukraine and on Russia than it is on this right now.
To Spain now, where there has been a significant drop in shellfish. The people of Galicia, who depend on the sea for their livelihood, say climate change and pollution are to blame. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
It's 5 a.m. on the Arauza estuary in northwestern Spain. Alfredo and Joaquin are on their batero, or fishing boat, hauling in tons of mussels. Galicia is Europe's biggest shellfish provider and second in the world only to China. These bateas, or platforms made from eucalyptus wood, are unique to Galicia and help produce over 150,000 tons of mussels each year. Now that's thanks to a mix of fresh and salt water rich in nutrients. Mussels go from tiny seeds the size of a grain of rice to fully grown in 2 years on ropes hanging from these rigs. But a frightening fall in harvest has caused deep concern.
We are extremely worried. The Galician Sea, as we know, it is disappearing. If we keep going like this, then in 5 years, this is all gone. Climate change is affecting everything, and even the winds are not the same. The entire dynamic of the river is changing. Then there's the pollution, vineyard runoff, industrial waste from aluminium factories, wood pulping plants for paper, open-air mines, copper.
Some shellfish stocks have fallen by 90% in just a few years. Disastrous for the more than 22,000 people employed in the industry. Drive 20 minutes north to Compostela Beach and it's mainly women who seed and harvest famous Kareel clams along this shoreline.
When I started, there were 97 people working here. Now there are just 59 of us left. The solution is to do a proper study on what's happening to the sea, because it's obvious that climate change is already here. Not that it's coming, it's already here. I don't want to lose this tradition. My mother started working at 9 years old. She retired at sea. My grandparents retired at sea too. But it's looking very unlikely that I'll be able to do the same.
The story of shellfish in Galicia goes back to the Bronze Age. Whether it survives our age of consequence remains to be seen. Ken Brown, CGTN, Galicia.
And a last look at the headlines. A heated showdown. US President Donald Trump accuses Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy of overplaying his hand as their meeting in the Oval Office devolves into a shouting match. President Zelenskyy touches down in London ahead of a European summit on peace, saying he wants the US to stand more firmly with Ukraine. And there's no sign of an agreement on what next for the Gaza ceasefire as phase 1 of the deal officially expires. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. There's more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, though, it's The Agenda with Juliette Mann. For now, from all the team in London, goodbye.